The land had a smell that most people in Iberia Parish had learned to hate. The sour, mineral stink of standing water that never quite drained, of mud that swallowed boots whole, of 160 acres that had failed every man who'd ever tried to farm it. Min Tran breathed it in like perfume. He stood at the edge of the gravel road with his hands in the pockets of a jacket, too heavy for the Louisiana heat, staring across a stretch of half-drowned earth that the county called unimprovable on its own tax rolls. Cattails grew in clumps where soybeans should have been. A rusted-out plow sat sunk to its axle in one corner of the field, abandoned so long ago that a young cypress had grown up through its frame. Water sat in silver sheets across the low ground, catching the late afternoon light, and somewhere out in the middle of it, a heron picked its way between the tussocks like it owned the place, which, in a sense, it did. Nobody else wanted it. $4,000, the realtor had said on the phone, in the tone of a man trying not to laugh. For the whole 160 acres. You understand it floods, Mr. Tran? It's not just wet in spring. It's wet always. Nothing but bald cypress and cottonmouths out there. I understand, Min had said. And you still want it? Yes. There had been a pause on the line. The particular silence of a man deciding whether to talk someone out of a bad decision or just take the money. The money won the way it usually does. 3 days later, Min Tran signed his name at the bottom of a deed that every other person in the parish considered a joke, and became the sole owner of the worst farmland in 3 counties. He was 42 years old. He had $1,100 left in a bank account in Lafayette, a wife and a 15-year-old daughter sharing a rented room above a laundromat, and a set of calluses on his hands that had nothing to do with America at all. What the water remembered. 9 months earlier, Min Tran had been standing in a different kind of water, 8,000 miles away, in a delta where his family had grown rice for 4 generations. He'd grown up waiting behind his father through paddies the color of jade, learning by feel more than by words how the water should sit against your shin at each stage of the rice's life, how a field that looked flooded to a stranger was in fact a living machine, timed to the arrival and retreat of the flood the way a heart is timed to breathe. His father had learned it from his father. The knowledge lived in muscle and instinct more than in any book. When to open a levee gate and let the river in, when to close it and let the sun do its work, how a single degree of slope across a field changed everything about how deep the water pooled and how long it stayed. It was a farming that made no sense without water. It was, in fact, a farming that required exactly the kind of land that scared everyone in Louisiana away from a property. Ground that held water instead of shedding it, ground that flooded on a schedule nature had been keeping for 10,000 years before anyone thought to farm it. Min had left Vietnam for reasons he didn't discuss much, even with his wife, Lan. The kind of reasons that immigrants from certain places and certain decades rarely need to spell out to each other. A shrinking farm, a river that had begun flooding wrong because of upstream dams, a cousin already settled in Louisiana who wrote long letters about shrimp boats and crawfish ponds in a strange, green, water-heavy country that reminded him, in flashes, of home. There is more water there than anywhere else in America, the cousin had written. You would not believe how much land nobody wants because of it. Min had read that line more times than he could count, on the flight over, in the shelter where his family first stayed, in the back of the restaurant kitchen in Lafayette, where he washed dishes 12 hours a day for the first 4 months, in the cramped room where he lay awake, listening to his daughter's breathing and doing arithmetic in his head that never quite balanced. Land nobody wants because of the water. He had grown up on land everybody wanted because of the water. Un. The laughingstock word travels fast in a town of 4,000 people, and it traveled faster still when it involved a foreigner doing something the whole parish agreed was insane. He bought the Guidry place, Earl Broussard told the men at the feed store, shaking his head slow, like he was delivering news of a death. Earl had farmed soybeans and rice on solid ground 3 miles up the road for 31 years, and he knew the Guidry place the way you know an old wound. Paid actual money for it, too. $4,000 for 160 acres of gator pond. Which one's he? Someone asked. Vietnamese fella. Works over at Boudreaux's kitchen, I hear. Or did. He know that land floods? Realtor told him straight out. He bought it anyway. There was a particular quality to the laughter that followed. Not cruel exactly. Not in the way men had feared cruelty might look in this new country, but the easy, dismissive laughter of men who believed they understood something the newcomer didn't, and who felt, in some low, unspoken way, better for it. Poor fella got taken. Somebody should have warned him proper. Well, it ain't like he's out much. $4,000. Nobody in that feed store had ever grown a single stalk of rice by flooding a field on purpose. Rice grew on solid, well-drained ground around here, the way it had been grown in Louisiana for over a century, dry-seeded, then flooded briefly with pumped groundwater at a controlled stage of growth, drained again for harvest. The Guidry place didn't just flood at the right time. It flooded all the time, unpredictably, fed by a low water table and a bayou that backed up every time it rained hard, which in South Louisiana was often. No pump could control it. No drainage ditch had ever tamed it. 2 generations of Guidrys had tried and failed and finally walked away, and the land had sat wild and half drowned for 11 years before Minh Tran showed up asking about it. At the laundromat that evening, Lan didn't laugh. She sat on the edge of their bed, still in the blue smock she wore at the nail salon, and looked at her husband with an expression he recognized from harder years than this one. "You spent almost half of what we have left," she said quietly, in Vietnamese, so their daughter wouldn't understand from the next room. On land, the man on the phone laughed about. "I know. Min. I know what I'm doing." He said it without heat, without the defensiveness of a man who wasn't sure. He said it the way his father used to say it, standing at the edge of a paddy, with the flood rising around his ankles while men from town shook their heads at him too. Lan studied his face for a long moment. She had married him 20 years ago in a Delta town, not unlike the country he was describing now, and she knew better than anyone alive what his hands could do with water and rice. "Show me," she said finally. Third, reading the land. The first weeks, Min did nothing that looked like farming at all. He walked. He walked the property at dawn before his shift at the restaurant, and again at dusk after it. In rubber boots he'd bought secondhand, carrying a notebook that quickly filled with sketches no surveyor would have recognized. He wasn't measuring the land the way an American farmer measured land, in terms of what needed to be drained, leveled, and dried out. He was reading it the way his father had taught him to read a paddy, where the water pooled deepest and why, where the ground held a memory of old field boundaries beneath the cattails, where a slight rise let water run off toward one corner and a slight dip let it collect in another. He found the bones of an old system almost immediately, low earthen berms collapsed and overgrown, that the original Acadian farmers who'd cleared this land in the 1800s had built for reasons nobody currently living remembered. He found a channel, silted in but still traceable, that must once have connected the field to the bayou. He found, on the highest ground at the northern edge, the collapsed footprint of what had probably been the Guidry family's rice-drying platform from back before soybeans took over and the flooding finally beat them. This was rice land once, he realized, kneeling in the mud with his fingers pressed into soil the color of wet ash. Before anyone here forgot how, the soil itself told him even more than the shape of the land. He'd learned as a boy to judge paddy soil by squeezing a handful and watching how it behaved, how it held together, how slowly water moved through it, whether it had that particular dense, clay-heavy texture that made a field hole flood water instead of losing it to the earth below. The soil under his boots on the Guidry place was heavy, gray-blue clay, the kind Americans called gumbo, and cursed for ruining tractor tires and swallowing fence posts. It was exactly, precisely, almost unbelievably, the kind of soil his family had farmed for 100 years on the other side of the world. The land wasn't broken. It was speaking a language nobody local had bothered to learn. He wrote to his cousin that week, "I think I understand why nobody wanted this place, and I think that is exactly why it will work." Afa. Building in the wet season. What followed was 18 months of work that, from the road, looked to most passers-by like a man slowly going broke on a piece of land even a fool wouldn't touch. Min kept his dishwashing job at first. They needed the income, and rice doesn't grow overnight. But every free hour went into the field. He rebuilt the old berms by hand, and when he'd saved enough, with a rented small excavator for 2 exhausting weekends, he reopened the silted channel to the bayou, clearing it bucket by bucket, board by board, restoring a controlled connection between his fields and the water everyone else spent their lives trying to keep out. He divided the 160 acres into basins, not perfectly square American fields, but irregular, gently sloped paddies that followed the land's own contours, each one able to hold water at a slightly different depth, exactly the way the Mekong Delta farms of his childhood had been laid out generation after generation. People noticed the earthworks going up and assumed, at first, that he was trying to build drainage, trying to do what the Guidrys had failed to do, dry the land out and farm it the normal way. When they realized the berms were designed to hold water in, not push it out, the laughter took on a new, sharper edge. "He's making it wetter," Earl Broussard said, genuinely baffled, watching from his truck one evening as Min worked waist-deep in a half-built levee. "Boy's building dikes to flood his own field on purpose. Never seen anything like it." Min heard about these comments secondhand from his cousin, from acquaintances at the Vietnamese grocery in Lafayette, and later, once people started talking to him directly, from the men themselves, delivered with the particular bluntness of South Louisiana. He didn't argue. He didn't try to explain flood recession rice cultivation to men who'd never needed the concept in their lives. He just kept working through a spring that brought 2 hard rains and a summer that brought a tropical storm nobody bothered naming, watching his still unplanted fields fill and hold water exactly the way he'd engineered them to. The turning point, in terms of what the community believed about him, came not from anything he said, but from something Earl Broussard's own eyes told him one October morning. Driving past on his way to check his soybeans, Earl slowed his truck at the site of Min's fields, holding a perfectly even 4 inches of standing water across 60 acres, calm, uniform, obviously by design, while every other low spot in the parish that week was a chaotic mess of runoff and mosquito breeding grounds. Earl didn't say anything to Min that day, but he mentioned it, almost against his will, at the feed store that afternoon. "That water on the Vietnamese fella's land," he said slowly, "sits even, like he built it that way on purpose." "He did," someone said. "Ain't that the joke?" Earl didn't laugh this time. V. The first planting. In late spring of the following year, Min Tran planted rice on the Gidry place for the first time in living memory. He didn't plant it the way American rice farmers planted, dry seeding into prepared ground with a drill and flooding it, only later, briefly, at a controlled growth stage with pumped water. He planted the way his father had, and his father's father before that, establishing young rice seedlings in a shallow flood from the very start, then managing the depth of that flood across the growing season by opening and closing his rebuilt berms, letting the bayou's natural rise and fall do work that most modern farms spent enormous money on diesel pumps trying to replicate. It was, in the truest sense, flood recession agriculture, farming that didn't fight the flood cycle of the land but rode it, timed the entire life of the crop to water that the land was going to hold, whether a farmer wanted it to or not. Rice, alone among the major grain crops, doesn't merely tolerate standing water. Submerged in the right depth at the right stage, it thrives in conditions that would drown or rot almost anything else a farmer might plant. Corn, soybeans, cotton, all the crops the Gidrys and their neighbors had tried and lost to the same ground for 100 years. His daughter Mai, 16 now and fluent in the sharp, unimpressed English of American teenagers, came out to help on weekends and watched her father move through the shallow water with an ease that startled her. She'd only ever known him as tired. Tired from the restaurant, tired from apartment stairs, tired from a country that made him start over at 42. Out here, ankle-deep in a flooded paddy under the Louisiana sun, he moved like a younger man. He moved like someone who was, for the first time in years, not translating himself into somebody else's language. "You really know what you're doing," she said one afternoon, half question, half discovery. "I have known since before I could reach the top of your grandfather's boots," Min said, smiling in the way he rarely allowed himself to anymore. "I just needed land that would let me remember it." The whole parish watched that first season with the specific, half-hoping to be right attention of people who placed their bets. Men slowed their trucks along the gravel road. Someone from the parish extension office drove out twice, notebook in hand, more curious than skeptical by the second visit. Earl Broussard, who lived closest, found reasons to walk his fence line more often than the fence strictly required. What they saw over that summer was rice that shouldn't have been growing at all. Not on the Gidry place, not on ground the whole parish had written off as agriculturally dead, standing tall and green in even shining sheets of water, exactly as healthy as any rice on the good dry ground 3 miles up the road. 6. Harvest. The harvest, when it came in September, was modest by any large-scale standard. 60 planted acres, a first-year yield that Min himself considered merely acceptable rather than exceptional. Hampered by soil he was still learning after a decade away from paddies of his own. But it was real. It was rice, grown on ground the entire parish had agreed, for 11 straight years could grow nothing at all. Word of it reached further than the feed store this time. A reporter from the Daily Iberian drove out to photograph a sight nobody in the parish had seen in generations, a rice combine working a flooded field on the old Gidry place, cutting through standing water and gold-green stalks, while a heron, displaced from its longtime home, watched with apparent disapproval from a fence post. Earl Broussard, when the reporter asked him for a quote, said something that made it into the paper and eventually into the story people told each other about that whole strange, doubted, ultimately vindicated year. "I farmed next to that ground for 30 years, Earl said, "and I never once thought about what it wanted to grow. I only thought about what I wanted it to stop doing. This fellow looked at the same dirt and asked a different question. It wasn't a grand admission. Earl didn't apologize exactly, and Min never expected one. But it was, in the careful economy of rural Louisiana speech, about as close to a public reversal as the parish was likely to offer, and it traveled through the community the way the earlier mockery had, fast and remembered. Except, what grew after the rice? The rice itself might have been the end of the story if this were a smaller kind of story. It wasn't. Because what Min Tran had actually planted on the Gidry place, that first strange season, wasn't only rice. It was a demonstration, visible from the gravel road discussed at the feed store, photographed in the local paper, that roughly 11,000 acres of chronically flooded, agriculturally worthless low ground scattered across the parish, land that families had been quietly writing off for a generation, might not be worthless at all. It might simply have been waiting for someone who knew what question to ask it. The following spring, two of Min's neighbors, men who'd spent years pumping water off similar low ground at real financial cost, trying to force it into soybeans that always came in thin and disappointed, came to him with an offer that would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier. Would he teach them what he knew? Min said yes before they'd finished asking. Over the next several years, what had been the single mocked purchase of one immigrant farmer grew into something the parish extension office eventually gave a name to in its reports: a small flood rice cooperative built on land nobody else wanted, farmed by men who'd spent their whole lives fighting water and had never once considered working with it instead. Min taught them to read a field the way his father had taught him, where the water would naturally pool, how a levee should be shaped not to fight the flood, but to hold it evenly, when to let the bayou in and when to shut it back out. A small mill went up 3 years later at the edge of town, the parish's first in decades, built with a mix of local investment and a state agricultural grant that specifically cited innovative flood-adapted cultivation as justification, language that made Min laugh quietly to himself the first time he read it, since the innovation in question was older than the parish itself, just innovative to people who'd never needed it before. The mill brought jobs. The jobs brought a little life back to a main street that had been steadily emptying for a decade. The feed store started carrying rice seed varieties it had never stocked before. A restaurant opened that put Louisiana flood rice on its menu as a point of local pride, the kind of phrase that would have sounded like a punchline 5 years earlier, and now drew customers out from Lafayette on weekends. Earl Broussard, 70 years old and still farming his solid ground 3 miles up the road, converted 20 of his own lowest, wettest acres to rice under Min's guidance in the 5th year of the cooperative. He'd resisted longer than most out of a stubbornness he didn't bother denying, but eventually the math and the years of watching had worn him down. 40 years I fought that low corner of my land, he told Min, standing at the edge of a paddy that had cost him nothing but soybean failures for 4 decades. You're the first person who ever showed me it wasn't broken. It was just speaking a different language than the one I knew how to listen to. Vate. What the land remembered and what it gave back. Min Tran is 50 now. The Gidry place. Nobody calls it that anymore, not really. The younger farmers in the parish just call it the Tran Fields, the way you'd name any land after the family who finally understood it, has grown from 160 flooded, laughed-at acres into the anchor of a cooperative that now farms close to 2,000 acres across the parish's lowest, historically hardest ground. Mai, 24 now, studied agricultural engineering in college and came back. A choice that surprised exactly nobody who'd watched her grow up walking those paddies beside her father to help modernize the cooperative's water management, blending her father's inherited, muscle-deep knowledge of flood timing with soil sensors and satellite flood mapping that would have seemed like science fiction to either of their ancestors. She likes to say that her father brought the wisdom and she brought the spreadsheet, and that the land, honestly, didn't care which language you used to finally listen to it. Lan still works at the nail salon 2 days a week, less out of necessity now than out of a stubborn attachment to the women she's grown close to there over the years. But she spends her Saturdays at the fields too, the way she did that very first season, standing at the edge of water that once seemed like the site of her family's ruin, and is now, undeniably, the reason her daughter came home. As for the $4,000 deed that started it, the one the realtor could barely say without a laugh, the one that made Min Tran, for the better part of 2 years, the parish's favorite story about a fool and his money, it still hangs, framed on the wall of the small office attached to the mill. Not as a trophy, exactly. Min has never been a man inclined toward pride of that particular, pointed kind. He keeps it, he says, as a reminder of something his father told him once, standing in a paddy on the other side of the world, in a language that had no trouble at all describing what the water was for. Everyone else was looking at what the land refused to be. I only had to ask what it wanted to become. The heron still visits the fields some mornings, picking its way between rows of rice instead of cattails now, apparently unbothered by the change. It is, in its own patient way, the oldest resident of the land, older than the Gidris, older than the Mockery, older than the deed on the wall. And if it has any opinion about the last decade's transformation, it has kept that opinion, like the water itself, entirely to itself.